Okay, moving on. In this presentation, we're going to talk about two smaller movements of art, the DeStijl movement and then Constructivism. Um, they both have just one image each in their descriptions. And what I'm hoping that you see here, especially after learning about Dadaism, hoping that you see we're really dealing with movements that are kind of that pre and post war, um, reaction. What we're going to be able to see is how the societies and pre and post war really influenced artists, and a lot of the art that came out of this time period was a reaction to that. If you haven't noticed that kind of trend, you will definitely be able to see it very clearly within these two movements. And that's definitely what we're going to be going over as well. So the way that these are organized, because they are small movements with one image, is a lot of the contextual information I've provided for you as a kind of key points, a description for the movement itself. And then that is just going to be, applicable information for the images. So you'll be able to see here that a lot of the information that comes more in the forefront. Then when we actually get to the image, we've covered most of the information. There's only a little bit left to say about it. So moving forward, we're going to talk about the DeStijl movement, which you can kind of put the time periods of 1917 to about 1931 in this movement. And when we talk about some of the main points of this movement, the first thing is it is a Netherlands-based movement. So some of the kind of grandfathers of this movement were based out of the Netherlands. And again, thinking geographically where we're at, we're very close to Germany, kind of Eastern Europe, and thinking about World War I, and how maybe life and society and psychology and all of that in this geographical location at this time period can influence art, since art is that reflection of society. So overall, the DeStijl movement really embraced an abstract form of art, and I would go as far as say non-objective. Okay, it's a completely pared down aesthetic, and it is only based in very basic visual elements. So what that means is we have art now that is extremely abstract, like I said, non-objective, and the artists of this movement really only utilize a few of the elements of art. So those elements and principles of art that we talk about all the time, we learned at the very beginning, we're not even going to be talking about a lot of them. These artists would only just kind of reuse a specific few of those elements. So that's what I mean by pared down, okay? Extremely simplified. And that simplification is a direct reaction against those decorative arts in excess, like Art Deco. And, Art Deco is not something that we covered in our AP art history, but we can definitely relate it to the Art Nouveau. That interior design, that decorative arts, the arts of the crafts of the past were really, really decorative, very detailed, and just, a lot going on. And this is an opposite reaction to that. There's a philosophical context to the DeStijl movement, and basically this like reduction of of elements. It was envisioned, by its creators. The purpose of that was to really try to create a universal visual language. Okay. And, some could argue that, well, visual language is universal, right? Yes and no. There's also a lot of cultural aspects that go into visual language. And because of those cultures, we may not be able to read things cross culturally as clearly, right? So the DeStijl artists were definitely trying to simplify and truly create this universal language that was appropriate to the modern era. And this modern era, you have to understand, is a time of a new world order and a spiritualized world order. And they're coming out of the First World War, and have lived through so much division, global division, between allies and enemies, and cultures, and really torn, hurt society that is now trying to come together and mend and create this new world order. And instead of being so kind of segregated in the sociological mindset, artists were trying to bring everybody together, and they thought that the best way to do that was to just create this very simple, very modern, very kind of universal method of creating art and craft. This movement was led by two painters, basically the grandfathers of this movement. One of them is Theo van Doesburg, and then the other one is Pierre Mondrian. And Pierre Mondrian is who we'll be focusing on for this movement. What I want you to know is, even though it was two fine art painters that started this movement, this philosophy of creating art was definitely applied to a host of media, and not just in the fine arts, painting, sculpture, but definitely in the applied arts, industrial arts, graphic arts, decorative arts, and beyond. And it really also had a huge kind of notoriety in the world of architecture. So I want you to take note of that. But we're not going to get much into it. Even though the DeStijl movement really pushed architecture forward and helped to create this, what's called the international style of architecture, we're going to cover that in our next unit when we talk about architecture of the 20th century and postmodern architecture. So we're going to save it for then. But overall, the artists, they envisioned nothing less than this fusion of form and function. So I need you to understand what that means, form and function. Art can be broken down into these two avenues, these two paths. Form focuses kind of on the aesthetics of the art, the way the art looks. Function is how it functions, okay? So utilitarian objects. So for example, form and function would mean I have made a cereal bowl out of clay, and that's the function of it. And how well does it function? How does the shape work for the food that I have in it? How does the size work for how much a human consumes, right? All those ideas of function. And then form has to do with, well, how does this bowl look? How does it look sitting in a cupboard on a shelf? Is it beautiful to look at? Is it lovely to hold? Is it lightweight? Is it heavy? So it's about bringing those two worlds together. We want to make things that work well, but we want to also make them beautiful. And the DeStijl artists wanted to just bring those two concepts together and make them absolutely equal. And this endeavor that they had, they called that the ultimate style. So that was kind of their mantra, trying to achieve the ultimate style. I've given just a few examples of DeStijl artworks that are not in our image set. I've given you a couple painting examples here where you can definitely see those minimal elements of art. We have shape and we have line, and that is it. We have very, very, very limited color palettes, and as a matter of fact, DeStijl artists only like to use the primary colors, okay? So if you have forgotten or if you never understood the importance of the primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, they are the three hues, the three colors that are responsible for making every single other color in this world. And so that's important. They're kind of the three colors that have the most significance in the art world. And so most DeStijl artworks will only utilize those colors, plus black and white. Black and white in the painter's world, black and white are not colors. Black and white represent light. And we all know that color is a property of light. Okay, scientifically, we have color only because we have light, right? And so black and white represents light. White, okay, represents light, and black represents the absence of light. Okay, so that's how our colors of black and white exist. So the DeStijl artists were pretty committed to that color palette and really didn't stray. But what I really wanted to show you with the image in the middle is how this style of art, worked for the craft, worked for industrial design. Not just making paintings and sculptures, but making things that we use. And it's important because, remember, it does relate to those decorative arts, that interior design concept. Just a few more key ideas of the DeStijl movement that will help you kind of grasp and understand this movement a little bit further. So if we took the term DeStijl and translated it, it would simply mean the style in Dutch. And we talked about this earlier, but this is also a sociological response to the horrors of World War I, that wish to remake a society. Okay, you got to rebuild, right, after war. And they wanted to view art as a means of social and spiritual redemption. And so the members of this movement really embraced this vision of art and its, transformative potential. And they're not far off. I mean, we all know that art is moving, and if you think about all that religious art that we spent so much time looking at, and how artists, their intention was, they were also forms of propaganda, and their intentions were to, either sell, people back to the Catholic Church and entice them and, lure them back into the Catholic Church. And I mean, that's the purpose of art, is to, motivate, inspire, and, kind of get the viewers on board with a certain type of philosophy or mantra or endeavor. And so visually, though, the DeStijl movement, we talked about being, used with a limited array of the elements of art. And so honestly, we can narrow that down precisely to very clean geometric forms, more rectangles and squares than anything else, straight lines, extremely straight lines, and mostly horizontal and vertical lines. Very rarely would you see diagonals being utilized unless necessary. We already talked about really only primary colors and black and white, that, we're going to remain completely abstract. And not only was the art abstract, but even the titles were abstract. And so here's what's happening. The artists were not creating artwork that had some sort of deeper meaning or had any sort of symbolism whatsoever. It was exactly what you see. It was about primary colors, lines, and rectangles, and creating them in a composition that was, different every time. And there being some sort of order to it, but also a simplicity that everybody could relate to. And it was free of cultural interpretations. And it was free of social and political, um, you know, messages. It just was simply what it was. Really quite the most, I think, perfect definition of avant-garde. And that is exactly what we're dealing with here. So at no point should you ever look at some sort of artwork from the DeStijl movement and read into it. There's nothing to read into it. Okay, we're not talking about feelings or emotions or deep rooted Freudian philosophies or dreams or nothing at all. It just is exactly what it is. So, with all that being said, all of that applies to our image, which is number 136. And this is titled Composition with Red, Blue, and Yellow. See, there you have it. I told you. Even the titles are just straightforward. There is nothing to read into this. This is a painting created by Pierre Mondrian from 1930. It's an oil on canvas. If you were to Google Pierre Mondrian, you would see, I couldn't even give you a number, such a wide variety of these types of paintings. He just did huge series of rectangles, squares, lines with primary colors and black and white in just different compositional arrangements. Like I said, I couldn't even give you a number of how many he's done. So this is one of them. And like I said, it's oil on stretched canvas. And there's not much more to say about it except that, we only have primary colors and black and white. We have severe geometry of form, only right angles and grids, no shading or values, only very, very flat color. And again, remember, this was painted by hand. This was not something that was screen printed or block printed, or any sort of like industrial type of medium. This is a traditional canvas and painted by hand in a traditional way with a brush, but it was just about being extremely precise, and kind of working your paint to get it as flat and, brush free and value free as possible. This composition specifically is an asymmetrical composition where you still have balance going on, but you have balance happening because of opposing sizes. So you have this very, very large red square that is balanced out by the smaller squares and rectangles that are around it. And like I said before, it's extremely avant-garde and modern. When I thought about a comparison, I always like to go with the first thing that pops into my mind, because I think that, that's the first connection that I make, and therefore it has some real value. But I thought of the navigation chart. And again, the navigation chart, they do work with, diagonals and even sometimes, curvatures of the sticks to represent, the currents. But for the most part, especially the image that we were given in our image set, it's that grid system, and this grid system can be interpreted. It does have meaning, but it's also straightforward meaning. It literally maps out, the currents of the waters. Nothing heavy to read into it. There's no artistic expression happening here. It's just this straightforward piece that's made up of grids and lines, and to me, they were kind of one of the easiest comparisons. All right, so closing up DeStijl, now we're going to move into the Constructivism movement. This is, around the same period. Remember, a lot of these movements are parallel to each other, and if they're not parallel to each other, they're at least crossing over. And, one movement definitely can inspire the next movement and so on. And so I hope that you're understanding that. It's not so like clear cut and dry. The boundaries between movements are very blurred, and there's, like I said, a lot of simultaneous movements going on at the same, all at once. So constructivism is definitely going on around the same time as DeStijl. It went a little bit further than the DeStijl movement, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. But I'm going to do the same thing as I did with DeStijl. We're going to really kind of get into a lot of the contextual information and even some of the information about style and form, and that will all be applied then to our image that we've been given as an example. So when I talk about the Constructivism movement, I really need to talk about history and culture, because that's what it's deeply rooted in. And so Constructivism definitely was the last and the most influential modern art movement to flourish specifically in Russia in the 20th century. Okay, so this is a very geographically based movement in its origin. I mean, it went on to inspire other movements that flourished, but the origin of it, the start of it, is extremely geographically specific to Russia. And basically it evolved just as the Bolsheviks came to power in the October Revolution of 1917. And it acted as a lightning rod for the hopes and the ideas of many of the advanced Russian artists. And when I say artists, I am not just talking visual artists, but definitely writers, poets, musicians, kind of your whole fine art world. But it definitely inspired them and energized the most advanced Russian artists who were in support of the revolution's goals. So we really have just this huge like social and political revolution happening in Russia that really inspired and moved a lot of the artists in this region. So what it was overall was this new approach to making objects and making art, and to try to abolish traditional artistic concern with composition and all of those kind of traditional concerns, and replace it with the pure joy of construction. And so this movement became more about the materials and the actual putting together of objects and artwork than it was about the traditional ways of making art and adhering to a lot of those traditional rules and elements and principles and perspectives and all of that. So basically, constructivism really analyzed a technical approach to how we work with materials. And the whole hope of this, kind of this fresh look on material, was to try to boost a way of, putting this new philosophy of, focusing on material into a mass production, which would kind of service where Russia was at this time. Russia was in a real state of, kind of, like I said, revolution and rebuilding its society, and kind of taking a new approach. Basically what we had going on here was this shift from czars, which are kings and monarchies, ruling Russia for so long and making Russia a very oppressed society, a very poor society with gross imbalance of distribution of wealth, right? Which is something we're used to when talking about Europe, and talking about the French and the English, and that's happened everywhere in Europe. So we have a fall of the monarchy and a rise to this kind of socialist government. And so it really gave new hope and the opportunity for new ideas, and these artists, they were on board with it. And so how do they take these new perspectives and philosophies and apply it to art? Well, for them, it was, okay, we need to focus more on materials and production, and make that the art form, so that it will help stimulate, industrialization and production and the things that Russia had been lacking. So that's the parallel, and hopefully you can kind of grasp what I'm saying, but we will kind of get into it some more. So it was this the desire to develop a new form of art that was more appropriate to the democratic and modernizing goals of this Russian Revolution. And constructivists were to be more of the constructors of a new society. And they wanted to be cultural workers that were on par with the scientists in their search for solutions to modern problems. For the first time, Russian society was able to make change and step away from tradition and be empowered to do what you have to do to catch up with this modern society. So it was a really inventive approach as what constructivism was based in. Going on, though, however, the movement, definitely floundered in trying to make the transition from the artist studio to the factory. It really kind of never got out of the artist studio. Remember, their goal was to change the way that they look at art and make art and appreciate art, so that it would flow over and stimulate industry and factory. Okay. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen. But still, the art that was made was a definite reflection of, Russia during this time, the people during this time, society during this time. Russian constructivism was in definite decline by the mid-1920s. It was partially a victim of the Bolshevik regime's increasing hostility to avant-garde art. So, art was given this opportunity to kind of, step away from tradition, but really the Bolshevik regime, kind of rejected it and started to develop some hostility towards it. But this movement would continue to then be an inspiration for artists of the West, artists who had the freedom to kind of take these concepts of art, these new approaches of art that originated in Russia, and were able to let them grow and let them flourish. And they started to transform, but also sustain this constructivism movement. And eventually it was titled then the International Constructivism Movement, because, it was taken out of Russia, was applied, elsewhere. But really, it flourished a ton in Germany in the 1920s. And that legacy, that style of art really did continue to flourish into the 1950s. So, like I said, it was a short lived movement in the geographical origin in Russia. But once it spread out to the West, it really flourished for quite a long time. So what I have shown you down here are just some examples of constructivist art that was kind of during this time, not in our image set. And I tried to show you a variety. I wanted you to see also, like DeStijl, this was a concept of art that spanned many mediums. Okay, it wasn't just painting, it wasn't just sculpture, it was not just architecture, but it was all encompassing. And remember, since the constructivists really wanted to have these philosophies start in the artist studio, but then influence industry and start to lead in the factories and industry, they were very interested in more than just the fine art. They were very interested in more decorative arts and functional arts, utilitarian arts. Okay, so a lot like the DeStijl movement, it was kind of a design approach. And so a couple things we have here. This is a sculpture, a fine art sculpture, and you can see that it's constructed of many materials, mounted into a specific space in a gallery wall. But this, I thought, was a really great example of art being about construction and being about materials. And so you're going to see a lot of the sculpture during this time is more of that industry material. I mean, you're not going to see anything like, marble or anything like that. You're going to see more of that industrial output. So steel, wire, lumber, and things like that. And then the concept was to take these materials and the art, this is very conceptual, but the art, the essence of the art, the beauty of the art, the purpose of the art was the construction process, and that the materials should dictate the art piece instead of vice versa. So of all the movements in the past, it was always about an artist would have a vision, and then they would choose their material to help them emulate that vision. You would choose a material that would give you the best effects that you're trying to achieve. This was now a complete opposite. The materials were chosen, and then the art piece derived out of how the materials dictated it. And if we were able to finish, our AP Art History year and talk about kind of contemporary art, I feel that that constructivism was a strong precursor to what's called assemblage. Assemblage is a type of found object sculpture that is dictated by all of the scraps or the items that you find and you gather up, and then you take those items and you create a sculpture out of it. So to me, constructivism really was the influence for assemblage sculpture. This image right here what I'm showing you is, a great design, but what is hard to see here is that this is actually a textile design. So again, this is fabric that, has been printed on and designed and then, used for, upholstering chairs and things like that. So again, this is, a form of art that is not just for fine art, but also the applied arts. This we have a painting. Two of these are paintings. And then this right here is a model of an architectural structure. And so, again, it's about, the materials that are used and how they dictate the form. A last few key ideas for constructivism. The objects that, like I said, were created not in order to express beauty, okay, or the artist's outlook, or even to represent the world, but really their mission was to carry out a fundamental analysis of materials. So these materials are what would lead to the design of the functional objects. So again, there's no reading deep into this. There's no expression, hidden messages, not even, a type of, artist's expression per se, but more so about just kind of the love of the material. And the reason, again, for this is because of what was happening in society during this time. And I promise when we talk about the actual image that AP wants us to be familiar with for constructivism, it might all come together. It might help you understand this, constructivism philosophy and, why we care so much about the production of industry and material and, why is that the most important thing about art for them. There's an ethic of, truth to materials, the belief that materials should be employed only in accordance with their capacities in such a way that demonstrate the uses to which they could be put. So again, it's that merging of materials and function. Okay, that you should use the materials in order to then create the function of the art piece, and the form of artwork would take the artwork would be dictated by the materials, okay, not vice versa. And we've already talked about that. So this is our art piece, which again, it's kind of interesting, when you think about the artworks that AP picks out for us to be familiar with. But I think I understand, this is a really great art piece that is about kind of all the context, okay? It may not be so much about the philosophy, but it really does record contextually what is happening in Russia that inspired the artists of this movement. So this is image 167. It's called, the title is The Result of the First 5-Year Plan. It's by Varvara Stepanova from 1932. It is a photo montage. This is, I think, the only photo montage that we have. So we'll talk about that process here in a second. I've included a photograph of two artists during the Constructivist era. And the woman here on the right, well, that's Varvara. And so a lot of people are not aware that the artist for this piece was actually a woman. All right, so what we have here is a graphic art piece that was definitely used for political and propaganda purposes. It was an ode to the success of the 5-year plan. So the 5-year plan, this I think will help you understand the motivation behind the constructivist movement. The 5-year plan was a Soviet practice of increasing agricultural and industrial output for 5 years. Okay. It was launched in 1928. It was considered complete in 1932. It was an emphasis to grow industry instead of consumer goods. During this time, because we're, growing industry, making factories and all this stuff, there was a huge increase in the electrical output. And at the end of the 5-year plan in 1932, Stalin had announced that the 5-year plan had been a success. And actually, statistically, after the 5-year plan, Russia's industrial output went from 15% to 44%. So statistically, it was a huge growth for the country at the time. The production of raw materials had increased massively. The economic growth was 14% in just 1 year. This was especially good considering during this 5-year plan, what you have happening in America and Europe was the depression after the Wall Street market crash. So, you have the West in a state of depression, and then you have this Soviet country in this 5-year plan that's just growing industry, and their economy is growing, and they're the ones that are producing goods for trade, and I mean they're in a state of flourish. And so this after World War One and after their own type of revolutions, this was huge hope and promise, and just a fantastic sign of growth for Russia. This art piece then is an ode, kind of a dedicated piece to the 5-year plan. And it was a double-page spread in a journal, and I have an image of that journal on the next slide. It is so packed full of symbolism, from the colors to the images. There's a picture of Lenin in it that, even though Lenin, was deceased at the time, he's there to kind of stimulate that patriotism. It's a really powerful piece that I think not only is a historical recording about what is happening in Russia at this time, and specifically with this kind of initiative, this 5-year initiative, but it really helps define just the mentality of that constructivist movement. So up here in the corner, this is the journal that, this little magazine, artistic magazine, that was put out. I don't know how often, if it was monthly or bi-monthly or whatever, but this was the journal that this art piece was in. And I think it's very, very important to understand this technical process of photo montage. Basically, I call it a historical Photoshop. It's exactly what Photoshop is, but without having those digital capabilities. So it's the art of taking images from photographs or newspapers or text, or and trimming them, cutting them out, trimming them, cropping them, and then layering them and pasting them into like a collage format in order to create a new art piece. That's what photomontage is, okay? This art piece is packed full of symbolism, and instead of going through it point by point, I have given you a link here that I encourage you to click on, and it will this link is to a Khan Academy article, and within that article, it just goes through the symbolism of not only the colors, but all of the images that you see here, the historical reference, all of these things. The number, what does the number 5 mean? What does CCCD mean? Like, it'll interpret all of that symbolism for you. And I feel that that's going to be a better approach. You'll be able to copy it down right into your graphic notes, and it'll just do a better job of describing it. So when I think about this art piece and I try to compare it, two of them came to mind. And for one, it was the steer, this photograph that was known for kind of showing the two class systems. And for me, it was just kind of like this capturing of a social moment. And that was what I saw in terms of similarity between the two pieces, is capturing of a very important social moment. And also using photograph to do it, using photograph in different ways. I mean, this is just a straight up photograph, where here these are a collage of cut and trimmed photographs. But then I also compared it to the George Washington by Houdin, because this statue of George Washington was made to really emulate him as a leader. And I felt like that was the purpose of, having Lenin in this as well, that it was meant to kind of inspire and really keep the citizens motivated. So that was my connection to those two pieces. So I hope that you were, able to digest both the DeStijl movement and the Constructivist movement, kind of understand not only their relationship to society at the time, but also the relationship to, like I said, pre and post wartime, and how that relates to art movements.